It began in silence, the kind that follows before disaster. Millions watched as a routine transaction froze mid-confirmation. Then, without warning, wallets across continents blinked to zero. Billions vanished in seconds. Engineers stared at dashboards rewriting themselves, lines of code looping in impossible recursion. The system that promised unbreakable trust was rewriting its own truth. How could something built to be immutable undo itself? What if the patch was the breach? Somewhere, someone had just flipped the digital equivalent of gravity, and as the world scrambled for answers, one question echoed through the data void. If the truth can be rewritten, what's left to verify? Within minutes, panic rippled through every corner of the crypto world. Wallet balances vanished, withdrawals froze, and exchanges locked down in synchronized defense. The flaw wasn't just an exploit, it was an inversion of logic itself. Systems designed to prevent fraud had begun generating it. Evelyn's team scoured logs for traces that no longer existed. Somewhere, far beyond jurisdiction, the collective was watching the world burn, silent and efficient. By sunrise, global markets convulsed. Billions erased in a storm of red graphs. Commentators called it a systemic shock. But those who looked deeper knew this wasn't random. Someone had found a way to make the system betray itself. The headlines screamed, but the real story was buried in lines of code, rewritten by unseen hand. In the chaos, one voice stayed calm. Mine. Watching the digital meltdown from a cluttered apartment, I saw something no one else noticed. A pattern. Small, deliberate, elegant. This wasn't mass panic. It was choreography, and whoever conducted it had written themselves out of existence. Ward Siri. Sure. While the world screamed breach, the collective disappeared. No chatter, no signatures, just silence. The kind that sounds like confidence. Somewhere, encrypted drives cooled in unknown hands, holding billions in frozen wealth. And yet, as the panic grew, one thought refused to die. What if this wasn't theft at all, but correction? The first stories hit within hours. A teacher in Brazil lost her life savings. A father in India couldn't pay hospital bills. Every refresh of the screen was another heartbreak. But behind the noise, the same invisible signature appeared in every case. A fragment of identical code buried deep within the transaction trail. To the public, it looked random. To the trained eye, it was precision. Someone had mapped the global system's pulse and sliced through it with surgical timing. By midday, the company's executives stepped forward. Cameras flashed. Statements were drafted, rehearsed, rewritten. They blamed a sophisticated external actor exploiting a unique vulnerability. But behind those sterile words, the truth was simpler. The system had never been independently audited. Its foundation was faith, disguised as mathematics. The forensic work began that night. We combed through billions of transaction lines, tracing timestamps that had been subtly rewritten, like diary entries forged in perfect handwriting. But something was wrong. The logs didn't just hide data, they lied. They had rewritten themselves in real time, removing the trail before it was even visible. The money trail didn't lead to chaos, it led to choreography. Funds moved in perfect rhythm across dozens of networks, layered through shell accounts that existed for minutes before dissolving. It wasn't laundering, it was orchestration. Whoever was behind it understood not just the code, but the psychology of panic. They made the world chase shadows, while the real prize moved in daylight. By evening, the headlines had already chosen their villain, the largest crypto heist in history. But reality was more dangerous. This wasn't a single theft. It was a systemic mirror turned inward. Somewhere, the line between attacker and architect blurred. And as I pieced the fragments together, one thought chilled me to the core. What if the system wasn't attacked? What if it was following its own hidden design? It came as a whisper in the static, an encrypted message buried inside a public transaction block. No name, no location. Just a line. You're looking in the wrong direction. The sender called themselves Echo, whoever they were. They had access to internal documents no outsider should ever see. And the tone wasn't that of a hacker gloating. It was of someone trying to confess without being caught. The first call came through a secure channel hours later. The voice on the other end trembled, guilt mixed with fear. Echo wasn't a hacker. They were someone inside the system. Someone who had watched it crumble from within. They told us it was a routine patch, Echo whispered. But the patch changed everything. It wasn't a fix. It was a door. And just like that, the narrative shifted from an external breach to an inside betrayal. Sophia spoke in fragments that pieced together something horrifying. Months before the collapse, a quiet governance vote approved a change in the core protocol. A time sync patch designed to reduce latency between nodes. Only a handful of engineers understood what it really did. The patch didn't fix anything. It inverted one of the system's safety rules. The flaw wasn't an accident. It was authored. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, the collective debated their next move. Their encrypted channel pulsed with precision. Emotionless, mechanical, efficient. They weren't thieves in the traditional sense. To them, the exploit wasn't a crime. It was justice. We didn't take what wasn't ours. One message read, "We took back what was hidden." For the first time, I saw it clearly. The line between villain and vigilante was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. The final piece came when Sophia forwarded a single document, an internal memo titled Temporal Coordination Override. It described how the patch allowed transactions to be rewritten if they appeared out of sync. It wasn't just an error. It was an instruction. I stared at the timestamp. The memo was signed 3 weeks before the heist. The crime didn't exploit the system. The crime was built into it. We built the timeline again, piece by piece. Every block, every timestamp, every invisible correction. The deeper we went, the clearer it became. This wasn't chaos. It was choreography, disguised as coincidence. The system had rewritten its own past to fit a new truth. The collective hadn't needed to force their way in. They simply waited for the code to obey a hidden command. It was like watching a crime that the victim had rehearsed. The next morning, the company's official statement went live. Sophisticated attackers exploited unknown vulnerabilities, they claimed. But the forensic data told a different story. This wasn't discovery. It was design. Daniel Mercer stood before the press like a man performing damage control, not truth-telling. The public wanted a villain. He gave them one. And for a while, the world believed him. When we sent our findings to the authorities, the responses came in waves of confusion, out of jurisdiction. Data incomplete, awaiting clarification. The system of accountability cracked exactly where the money had, across borders, across laws. What started as a theft became a test of global cooperation, and humanity failed it spectacularly. No one wanted to be the first to admit the truth. The code that governed their wealth had no nation to belong to. Then Sophia sent one final message, a screenshot of an internal memo. Do not disclose. Contained risk scenario. It confirmed everything. The executives had known. The patch wasn't a last-minute fix. It was a calculated gamble. They'd weighed transparency against market panic and chosen silence. In their arrogance, they built a system that punished honesty and rewarded control. The real breach wasn't in the code. It was in conscience. But not everyone in the collective agreed. Their private chat, once precise and unified, splintered into arguments. Zero believed they had to expose the truth. That chaos was cleansing. Mikhail wanted to vanish with their winnings, claiming justice had already been served. In their silence, a moral fracture appeared, deep and irreparable. For the first time, their perfect machine of intent began to sound human. It began like a heartbeat. Sudden, sharp, synchronized. Across 5 continents, agencies tried to freeze assets linked to the stolen billions. For a brief, flickering moment, hope returned. Screens showed progress bars racing toward victory, but the collective had anticipated every move. The second the freeze commands went live, the funds splintered again into smaller, faster, smarter fragments. We weren't chasing criminals anymore. We were chasing ghosts through mathematics. Lawyers descended next, as fast and relentless as the code itself. Subpoenas crossed borders faster than planes. Governments issued statements promising justice. But in courtrooms filled with jargon and jurisdictional gridlock, truth became a prisoner of language. While the world debated definitions, the money kept moving. The collective wasn't hiding from law enforcement. They were hiding inside its limits. On the streets, the anger erupted. Protesters gathered outside exchanges and government buildings, holding signs that read, "Where's my money?" and "Code can lie." It wasn't just about stolen crypto anymore. It was about trust, transparency, and the invisible power of those who built the digital future. Markets trembled again, and for the first time, the industry's leaders feared something more than exposure. They feared accountability. Then came the break. A transfer stalled mid-route. One address, unmasked for just 7 seconds, revealed an institution's name. A top-tier bank, not a hacker haven, but a cornerstone of global finance. The stolen assets hadn't just passed through legitimate systems, they were stored there. When I confronted Evelyn, she said only one thing. Maybe that's where the real criminals are. When the system detected the trace, the collective made their final move. In one breathtaking act, they triggered an automated cascade, rerouting all remaining assets into a network beyond recovery. It wasn't a theft anymore. It was an erasure. The digital equivalent of burning evidence mid-trial. When it ended, the screens went dark. The trail vanished. The silence that followed wasn't victory. It was surrender. From everyone. It hit us like a second breach. But this one wasn't in code. It was in truth. Sophia's recovered emails showed that the so-called security patch had been approved by Daniel Mercer himself, weeks before the first test run. The timestamp aligned perfectly with the earliest hidden transaction. The impossible question echoed in my head. What if the patch was the breach? The line between prevention and permission had vanished. The system didn't fail by accident. It obeyed an order. When the memo leaked, denial turned to chaos. Executives were dragged before oversight panels. Investors demanded names. But Daniel Mercer didn't flinch. "We saved the system," he said. "Without that patch, everything would have collapsed months ago." His voice was steady, confident, rehearsed. The tone of a man who still believed in his own myth. And maybe he was right. Maybe the flaw wasn't a bug. Maybe it was the price of stability itself. The night after the hearings, I faced my own decision. The unedited report was ready. Names, documents, timestamps, everything. But publishing it could destroy more than reputations. Billions hung in fragile balance, markets already trembling. If the truth came out unfiltered, confidence in the digital world could collapse entirely. Silence, for once, felt safer than honesty. But as I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen, I realized withholding the truth made me part of the lie. While the world debated morality, Sophia vanished. Her apartment was left unlocked, laptop gone, phone smashed. The police called it voluntary disappearance. I called it what it was: silencing. Days later, an anonymous message appeared in my inbox. She told the truth. That was her mistake. Her absence haunted every report I filed. Every revelation came with a price, and she had paid it in full. The final hearings played out more like theater then justice. Executives walked free under the banner of systemic error. Lawmakers congratulated themselves for stabilizing markets. Meanwhile, the code remained untouched. The same flaw, the same door, still open. As I walked out into the freezing dawn, I realized this story would never end with resolution. It would end with repetition. Because as long as power hides behind complexity, truth will always be optional. Months passed, markets steadied. People moved on, at least those who could. For others, recovery was a word that never arrived. The teacher in Brazil took a second job. The father in India borrowed money from strangers online. Everyone learned to live with invisible loss. I used to think the story ended with the hack. Now, I understood. The real damage wasn't financial. It was faith. Once trust collapses, you can't patch it back together. The industry moved fast to reinvent itself. Committees were formed, promises made, new words invented. Transparency layers, trust oracles, self-healing consensus. But the same faces wrote the new rules. Daniel Mercer was reappointed as advisor to a new blockchain consortium. I attended the press release, surrounded by applause that sounded like denial. Progress, they called it. I called it repetition with better lighting. Of the collective, only fragments remained. One of their accounts resurfaced briefly, sending a single transaction. 0.001 BTC to an anonymous relief fund labeled debt repaid. Then, silence. Rumors placed Mikhail somewhere in Iceland, Zero in the Balkans, Alex gone completely. Some said they vanished into the same shadows they once controlled. I wondered if they still watched the network, not for profit, but to make sure no one else tried what they did. I published my final report under a single title: The System That Hacked Itself. It didn't accuse anyone. It just told the truth, as much as could be proven. Some called it journalism, others betrayal. But when I saw the message boards fill with survivors sharing their stories, I knew the point wasn't exposure. It was memory. If the code could rewrite itself, then the least we could do was refuse to forget. I sometimes replay that night in my head, the screens going dark, the silence afterward. The system still runs today, patched again, praised again, trusted again. But I've learned that perfection in code means nothing if the people behind it remain flawed. Every system is only as honest as the humans maintaining it. And as long as truth can be rewritten, verification will always be an illusion. In the end, it wasn't the money they stole. It was certainty.